to draw attention to those important points.
Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr Chairman, Labour is supporting this bill, although, as you will have heard, there's a discussion to go on as to whether or not the particular part or particular section that deals with the matter of regulation is to be supported or not. Mr Speaker, this bill amends the International Finance Agreements Act of 1961 and it does allow the government to meet its obligations as a member of various financial institutions, including both the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. The amendment bill provides for New Zealand to recognise the changes to the Articles of Agreement of the International Monetary Fund, which were agreed to by the IMF governors in 2008 and 2010. And I think, sir, in 2008, and I'm be subject to correction here, but one of the governors was the now Sir, or Dr. the Honourable Dr. Sir Michael Cullen. And I think that the Honourable Mr English has continued that. And New Zealand has quite properly played an active role in the IMF, and unlike a number of the other international financial organisations where associate ministers have been delegated off to do the representation, New Zealand ministers of finance have seen the IMF as a very important organisation and one which has senior representation at the governor level. I think, in fact, in the history of the previous government, I think there was only one occasion when the Minister of Finance himself wasn't able to make it. Mr Chairman, the 2008 and 2010 agreements doubled IMF quotas and shifted voting power towards the dynamic emerging market in developing countries and effectively did a shift from countries which were overrepresented to those that were underrepresented. It wasn't a massive shift, it was about a 6% shift in the balance of power. And what results from that is a more representative IMF executive board, with advanced European countries reducing their representation in a way which I think it's fair to say is an indication of changes that have occurred certainly from a period well before the IMF and the relative power of Europe and the rest of the world in financial matters. The 2008-2010 agreements are separate from the discussions of G20-backed US $430 billion IMF firewall, which has been proposed in recent months. So this is something which predates that sort of arrangement. Mr Speaker, this legislation will increase New Zealand's quota commitment to the IMF. However, members of the new Arrangements to Borrow program, including New Zealand, have agreed that they will take a corresponding decrease in their commitment to that program. Overall, this means that our commitment to the IMF remains relatively constant, moving only from 1,518 million of the drawing rights to 1,592. So that's it's a change of from approximately 2.9 to $3 billion New Zealand. Mr Speaker, one of the issues that we have in this bill is that regulation-making power, so that in future updates can be made by regulation. This power simplifies the process, but in doing so takes away from the Parliament something which has been a traditional right, and that is where there is potential expenditure, the right of parliamentary control. In this case, not through a budget process, but through a treaty-making process. Mr Speaker, what we want to make sure is that as the IMF goes through, Mr Chairman,
Honourable Trevor Mallard.
as the IMF currently goes through its quota formula, it's also scheduled to complete the 15th General Review of Quotas by 2013. Mr Speaker, these changes, Mr Chairman, these changes are not expected to be accompanied by any changes to the Articles of Agreement. Governance reviews, which do imply changes to the Articles of Agreement, are usually completed every 8 years, although we've seen with the 2008 and 2010 changes that on occasion this sort of legislation is called for on a more frequent basis. And that, of course, there's no secret to the fact that the global financial crisis contributed to the need for the pretty rapid reaction, or very rapid for the IMF reaction in 2010, well in advance of the expected 2016 review. Mr Chairman, since the International Finance Agreements Act in 1961 came into force in that year, when Keith Holyoake would have been the Prime Minister of New Zealand, it's been amended 7 times in 1966, 1968, 1975, 76, 92, 98 and 2007. Of the 7 amendment acts, 4 amended the articles of the IMF, those in 1968, 1976, 92 and 98. And the 3 other amendment acts gave effect to New Zealand's membership in other international financial institutions. It's important to note that once a requisite majority of members have accepted any amendments to the articles, these changes are applied to us whether or not we've passed our legislation. So we're in a relatively unusual situation where there is the possibility of us having an obligation which has not been recognised in New Zealand law, and I think even members on this side of the House think that it is important, if we can, to, as far as is possible, align New Zealand law with the obligations that are put on us. So, Mr Speaker, and there are additional reasons here, and because both in leading up to the 2008 and then again for the 2010 reforms, and the 2008 reforms are already in effect, we supported both those sets of reforms, and therefore I think, unless there's a very good reason for the Parliament not doing it, then it is appropriate for the Parliament to ensure that the reforms that we have supported internationally are then reflected in New Zealand law. It's a matter, I think, of keeping our word and honouring our international obligations. And, of course, there are a lot of countries around who do not do that. In fact, probably the lead country with international obligations in this area, the United States, is the country which is one of the worst at fulfilling its obligations in other areas, the United Nations, for example. But New Zealand is a country where I think there is probably multi-partisan, but certainly a bipartisan approach that where you give your word to an international organisation, or where you are a member of an international organisation and there are obligations, you meet them. And of course, Mr Speaker, Mr Chairman, if Parliament did nothing, or if we disagreed with these changes, then the changes would nevertheless come into force for New Zealand, with effect from the date that they come into force for all IMF members. Mr Speaker, the point which a number of members have made, and we will get to, I just want to do an overview of, is that we are very, very concerned about the suggestion that future updates will be done by regulation. You know, there is a matter of balance in this. On the one hand, Mr. Chairman.
John Hayes.
Mr. Chairman, I move the question be now put.
The question is that the question be now put. Those of that opinion will say aye. Contrary, no. Party vote. The clerk will conduct a party vote.
New Zealand National.
59 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
34 opposed.
Green Party.
14 opposed.
New Zealand First.
7 opposed.
Māori Party.
3 in favour.
Mana.
1 opposed.
Act New Zealand.
1 in favour.
United Future.
1 in favour.
Brendan Horan.
1 vote opposed.
The ayes are 64, the noes 57. The question will now be put. And the question is that clause 1 stand part. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. Party vote. The clerk will conduct the party vote.
New Zealand National.
59 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
34 votes in favour.
Green Party.
14 opposed.
New Zealand First.
7 votes in favour.
Māori Party.
3 in favour.
Mana.
1 opposed.
Act New Zealand.
1 in favour.
United Future.
1 in favour.
Brendan Horan.
1 opposed.
The ayes are 105, the noes are 16. Clause 1 will stand part. The question is now is that clause 2 stand part. I give the call to Brendan Horan.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I rise to speak to the International Finance Agreements Amendment Bill and to the